Thanks for being here. Subscribe to Cheating Stories Best, so you don't miss new stories.
Edward or Edward Chomsky? Who's better? Today's story with a similar plot. Enjoy watching it. I was lucky. I was born into a normal family. Unfortunately, my mother had a difficult birth, and after I was born she could not have any more children. So she gave all her tenderness to me. I grew up a happy child, bathed in my parents' love. But my parents' love was not fanatical. They understood that I could grow up to be a complete spoiled egomaniac, not adapted to the realities of life. There were plenty of examples of this kind around, and my mom and dad did everything they could to teach me how to live independently in the world around me. My mother shoved me into various sections and clubs, which I didn't stay in for long. But in 7th grade in a pioneer camp I heard the guitar and fell in love with the instrument. In the fall I asked my mom to enroll me in a music studio, where they taught me to play the guitar. Mom, remembering my lessons in clubs and sections, was skeptical of my request, but finally signed me up for classes and paid for a 6-month course. After high school I joined the Army, figuring that the Army training would come in handy in life. After serving my time, I went home as a sergeant major. A girl was waiting for me in my hometown. Frankly speaking, I did not expect that she would wait for me and would not marry a rich man. But she waited for me. I rested from military service for almost a month, and then got a job at a machine tool factory as a turner. At the same time, I went to the Polytechnic University as a part-time student. I decided to become a mechanical engineer because I felt an attraction to technology. And, of course, I married the girl I loved. On December 6th, we got married, and in September Michelle gave birth to a son, whom we named Edward, just like me. Michelle was the exotic name of my beloved wife. A year after the wedding, she was finishing her studies at a construction college and was going to enter a specialized university. I had a goal-oriented wife. We lived on average income. We didn't live in poverty or glamour. I worked at the factory, and in the evenings I played in the restaurant, supplementing the family budget with extra income. I helped Michelle with the baby as much as I could. At night I got up to feed the baby. Sometimes warming baby food in hot water, I would fall asleep with my head resting on the dining table. As time went on, my son grew older and Michelle prepared for exams. In August she left for Capital City. A week later I already knew that she had passed her entrance exams and had been accepted to university. And I decided to quit my studies in order to give my wife a chance to study. While Michelle was chewing the granite of science, I washed diapers, drove my son to clinics, and did what mothers usually do. I deliberately gave up my career to let Michelle pursue her dream of becoming a civil engineer. Finally, my wife got her diploma and returned to her hometown. My son was 6 years old by that time, and we were going to school. Michelle found a job in a design firm, which soon turned into a successful construction firm. Michelle was, in fact, a capable, if not talented engineer. 5 years later she was seated as Deputy Director of Capital Construction, and a few years later she became Vice President of the company and a 30% shareholder. My wife went from being just a girl to a successful businesswoman. I still worked as a turner and played the occasional restaurant in the evenings, unfaithfully trying to realize my unfulfilled dream of becoming a musician. The years flew by at the speed of a courier train. The time came, Edward graduated from high school and was preparing to go to university. He decided to become, as I had once done, a mechanical engineer. My wife managed her company with a steady hand and was firmly established on the board of directors. She also tried to lead the family. Lately Michelle was advising me in every way to change my occupation, hinting transparently that she was not satisfied with life with a simple turner. A man not in her social circle. At one time she strongly suggested that I work in her company, but I categorically refused to change anything in my life. I was satisfied with everything. At work I was appreciated as an excellent specialist. Evening music making warmed up my soul. My son and his successes were a joy to me. I should say that my son and I were very close. He shared all his secrets and mysteries with me. I was the first to know that he had a girlfriend and that their relationship grew into a great love. The girl was really very pretty. With one flaw. She was from an orphanage. When Michelle found out, there was a scandal in the house. It's your upbringing. You indulge Edward in everything. What girl? That mongrel of a mongrel? My son deserves better than that. My friends have wonderful daughters to marry our Edward, or do you want him to be a common laborer like you? At these words I stood up and silently left the room. And I said to my son, think for yourself. You are an adult and this is your life. Whatever you decide, I will support you. Several times I accompanied my wife to social events. But I did not know anyone there, and I caught a contemptuous, astonished looks of well-groomed men and women. Not my circle. I had nothing in common with them. Michelle sensed this and stopped dragging me along. By this time we had moved to a country house. But soon Edward left for the capital and our house was empty. My wife and I were left alone. I was already 46, and Michelle a year younger. His 45th birthday she decided to celebrate with an unprecedented scale. She bought out the best restaurant in town for a whole evening and invited guests from her circle. My wife and I stood at the entrance to the banquet hall and greeted the guests. Or rather, she was greeting, and I was just collecting gifts and giving them to her assistants. I saw him immediately. He was a young man in a strict cream suit, which fit his athletic figure well. His tan face was perfectly shaded by his blonde hair. Fancy perfume and a haughty, sarcastic look. It was in relation to me. He looked at Michelle with lust and love. He held her hand in his, making a congratulatory speech, looking her straight in the eye. Then he kissed her fingers and gently squeezed her palm. Then he turned toward me imposingly. You have a charming wife. Take care of her. Carelessly nodded and went to the other guests. I looked at my wife. Her eyes shone with happiness. Seeing my somewhat perplexed look, she condescended to me and explained. This is our client Edward Chomsky. We are building a residential complex for him. At that she was very far from me in her thoughts. All night Michelle hovered around admirers. Chomsky, too, did not leave her side. They chatted nicely, danced, talked to the guests. I had the impression that my Michelle had forgotten that she had a husband. I could hardly wait until the celebration was over. From my corner, I saw Michelle say a warm goodbye to Chomsky, walking him to the exit. That's when I realized I was losing my wife. You just can't cheat the heart. There was more to their relationship than just a client/contractor relationship. A month after my wife's birthday, I was coming home from work. A larger black car loomed in front of our house, and a man and a woman were kissing passionately. She wrapped her arms around his neck and seemed to have her lips in his mouth. You know, I was not at all surprised when I recognized the woman as my wife. The lucky beau was, of course, Mr. Chomsky. Suddenly Michelle saw me. She sharply recoiled from her lover. Edward, are you? She stretched out in disappointment. I took her hand. Michelle, let's go home. I tried to take my wife away. Buddy! Can't you see she doesn't want to go with you? Chomsky said in a contemptuous and mocking tone. 2 bodyguards appeared from behind him. Let the woman go and get out of here. His tone became menacing. Michelle was silent. And you do not forget that this is my wife. I tried my best to control myself. But I was already approached from 2 sides by Chomsky's guards. And I snapped. I let go of Michelle's hand, turned around and kicked one of the muzzleloaders in the kneecap with my right foot, simultaneously undercutting him. The heavy carcass fell to the pavement with a crash. I turned sharply toward the second and, stepping to my left, struck him in the bridge of the nose with my right hand. The bodyguard flew sideways, hitting his head on the body of the car. From the corner of my eye, I saw the driver trying to get out of the car with a baseball bat. I kicked the door open, and the brave man collapsed on the seat, clutching his broken nose with his hand. It all happened so fast that the sweet couple didn't realize anything. Chomsky looked at me with his mouth hanging open, terrified, expecting me to get him. Michelle clutched at his sleeve with both hands. Edward, go home. I'll be right there. Her voice trembled with excitement. Do not make a slaughter. I turned and went into the house. Without undressing, I went into the kitchen and tried to pour myself some vodka. My hands were shaking so much that I had to drink from the neck. Michelle appeared in the doorway. We need to talk. You bet we do. Edward, I met a man. She was silent, gathering her thoughts. And I fell in love with him. We've been together 6 months. I don't want to deceive you anymore. I'm going to him. I'll explain everything to my son. I think I deserve a little female happiness. You're good. But you're stuck in place. You have no prospects. With you frankly bored. We have outgrown our marriage, our relationship. She was silent again, waiting for my reaction. But I stubbornly remained silent. I want to be with me was a successful man. A man with whom I have common interests. A man. I interrupted her emotional monologue. Do not waste words. It's clear. Go on. I stood up. That's it? You won't tell me anything else? Michelle was clearly disappointed. What am I supposed to say? Advice and love. I looked at the bottle. Wait. I'm going to leave now. You can live here. This is your place, too. In short, Michelle babbled on and on. We can stay on good terms. We've been together for a quarter of a century. We're not strangers. I regretfully looked at the unfinished bottle and left the house without saying anything. It was impossible to keep Michelle, and there was no point. They say you have to fight for love. Bullshit. Love either exists or it doesn't. Everything else is pink snot. It's a shame about the wasted years. Although I didn't get drunk, didn't fall into a groggy stupor. There was only one feeling in my heart. Resentment. I really didn't understand how she could leave someone I'd lived with for so long. Why, it was clear. I was not up to her level with my education, my manners, my showing off. I didn't even have a college education. Kill yourself over the past? What was the point? There was no going back. And what's the point? It was easier to cut that period out of my life and try to start over. 46 years is not a sentence. I spent the night at my parents' house. I did not tell them much about my misfortune, and they did not ask too much. My mother, of course, was upset. But she didn't bother me. I hardly slept at night. I smoked through the window, inhaling the cigarette smoke diluted with cold air with pleasure. And gathered my thoughts. In the morning, Edward called me. Dad, are you divorced? His voice sounded anxious. What have you gone on a bender? Daddy, you're not a boy. Talk to your mother. Apologize at last. She'll forgive you. She loves you. Edward, it's more complicated than that. It's not about me. She found someone else? There was so much grief and disappointment in his voice that I inwardly shuddered. Son, don't be so hot. She's still your mother, no matter what happens. She loves you. Everything that happened was about our relationship. I try my best to reassure my son. We are one, you and I. Everything that concerns you concerns me. I grew up in your arms and I won't leave you for the sake of this. Edward didn't finish, choking with rage. Papa, don't worry, she's not worth it. I'll be there soon. Then Michelle called. Edward, what's with all the whims? You're a grown-up. You have to accept life as it is. Why should we quarrel? She started in her mentor-like tone. Why did you leave? This is your home, too. I didn't kick you out. I passed out. It was unbearable to listen to it. Michelle called again and again. In the end, I turned off the phone. 2 days later, Son arrived. Dad, I was at Mom's. I tried to talk to her. But she called this, her. She said she had no secrets from the man she loved. That's what she said. Love her. How's that? Why is she doing this to us? He fell silent. Tears rolled from his eyes. Her boyfriend kept smirking, and then he hugged her. He was overwhelmed with emotion. I don't have a mother anymore. I hate that. I didn't try to change his mind. Let him decide for himself. 2 months later, we were divorced. 6 months later, Michelle married Mr. Shumsky. She tried to get in touch with Edward, but he didn't answer her calls. The wedding was a big affair. It was celebrated in the poshest restaurant in town. Mr. Shumsky got a great trophy. A sea of guests, popular pop singers. All the high society was at this wedding. Except, they say, the bride's mother cried all the time and went home early, taking her father. And the son refused to come, although Michelle made every effort to get him there. Even Shumsky himself came by to see Edward, asking for his mother's support. On the evening of that day, when the wedding was thundering, I was walking along the alley of an abandoned old park. It was getting dark. The chilly northern wind was trying to tear the clinging yellow leaves from the wet asphalt. The street lights were lit. I walked leisurely along the sidewalk, soaked with drizzling rain, betraying my shadow, like a baton, from one streetlight to another. I felt sick to my stomach. I felt disgusted that I had lived so long with a deceitful woman. Surprisingly, I was calm. No despair or regret. I had received a good inoculation from family life, but I could not predict how things would turn out. I was constantly wondering how to live. 46 years old is not old. I hadn't decided what I was going to do yet, but I knew for sure I had to change my life. It's hard for a slave to live free. For the years of my marriage, I got used to having my wife to solve almost all the global issues of my life. It was easier that way. I indifferently drifted with the current and eventually swam in. Now my wife is drifting through life with someone else. Did I love Michelle? I did. And worst of all, I do now. Despite all my bravado. But the train sailed. She's the wife of another, more fortunate and richer man. At least that's her equal. As she said the last time we met, there's so much to talk about. Of course, I missed Michelle. Her eyes, her hands, her body, finally. We had crazy intim until the very last moment. Crazy! I squeaked. For 6 months, there had been a third man invisibly present in our marital bed. She was having a night with me just intimate, not love, because she loved someone else and thought about his Shumsky. I kissed her after my lover, unwittingly licking the traces of his love. I can imagine how they laughed at me. How disgusting it all was. And after all that, she offered to stay friends. At the beginning of winter, my son called. "Daddy, I'm getting married." The son's voice vibrated with joy. To Natasha. I knew that Natasha, that girl from the orphanage. Congratulations. I'm glad you've made up your mind. I fell silent, waiting for the rest of the story. Daddy, we're inviting you to the wedding. We'll only have the closest people together. A few friends and you. Natasha really wants to meet you. The wedding is on December 6th. Thank you, Edward. I'll try to be there. I was happy for my son. I only wish he'd be all right. Dad. Edward spoke again after a short pause. Your ex won't be here. I didn't even tell her. I don't want to see her. The son stubbornly didn't want to call her mother. Edward, she loves you. After all, she's your mother. I tried to talk sense into my son. What's our fight with her got to do with it? Dad, we've already discussed it. Let's not talk about sad things. Come here. Natasha and I are waiting. My son turned off his phone. The phone kept ringing and ringing. The person at the other end seemed to know perfectly well that I was home and waited patiently for me to be able to answer. Hello? I squeaked out in a sleepy voice. Edward, sang a pleasant woman's voice. I'm calling on behalf of Inga. It was said in such a way that when I heard this name I had to shudder with happiness. In fact, the name meant nothing to me. There was a pause in the phone. I was about to hang up when the woman continued. Could you be at the Solid Bank at 12 o'clock? I looked at the alarm clock. The hands showed 20 minutes past 12. I couldn't. Why not? The woman was surprised in a childish way. Because I do not understand why I need it. I'm not going to take a loan from your bank. The name of Inga does not tell me anything. By the way, you haven't introduced yourself either. I'm sorry. I'm Jean, Inga's secretary. She wants to talk to you about a job. A job? I was surprised. I have a job. Edward. A visit to the bank doesn't bind you to anything. The car will bring you in and take you out. It's up to you anyway. Shanna's voice was enveloping. And maybe this is the beginning of a new life. I wonder what this Inga wants to offer me. Well, not the position of manager. Jean turned out to be a young blonde girl in a breathtakingly short skirt. I even stared at her shapely legs and flesh-colored stockings for a while. Hello, Edward. Her eyes shone with genuine happiness at seeing me. Come in, Inga was waiting for you. She opened before me a massive oak door with a sign manager. In a huge office, furnished in the style of high-tech, stood a huge desk, at the head of which sat a young woman in her 40s in business dark green suit. When she saw me, she smiled, fixing a lock of white hair falling on her forehead. Hello, Edward, come in and have a seat. Tea, coffee? Thank you, I just had breakfast. I pretended to be a jerk on purpose, to annoy the mistress of the office. Well, as you wish. She was not at all embarrassed by my answer. Before we get down to business, I want you to watch a little movie. She pressed a button on her computer and a black and white movie played on a big screen hanging on the left wall. The screen was showing footage of me smearing Mr. Shumsky's guards on the asphalt. I looked questioningly at the banker. This is the video from the camera in front of your house. I am friends with your neighbor, and he kindly provided me with this footage. As far as I know, Mr. Shumsky has not made any accusations against you. Shit. How banal. Is she trying to blackmail me? That's the first thing that came into my head. Inga smiled. Mr. Zagorski, I didn't call you here to blackmail you. I want to offer you a job. It was as if she read my mind. I was silent. A job as my bodyguard. I am going through a difficult time, and I need a trustworthy man by my side. She smiled wearily. Judging by this movie, she nodded at the screen. You can handle it. And what makes you think I'm reliable? I made some inquiries about you. Besides, I know a little of your ex-wife Michelle Zagorskaya, now Mrs. Shumsky. The banker took in her hands a thin blue folder. It was she who recommended me to you? I began to boil. That's not enough to be the protégé of a society girl. Absolutely not. I do not need anyone's recommendation. The mistress of the office stood up. I'm not rushing you. Think it over till tomorrow. If you decide, call me. She pushed the card with her index finger, and it slid across the perfectly smooth surface in my direction. I kept my gaze fixed on the woman in admiration. Yes, a suit, and you could have worn a longer skirt. In the morning I dialed a simple number. Yes? A familiar voice answered. I agree. When should I start? Immediately. The car is already outside your house. The banker passed out. I looked out the window. There was a big black Lexus with tinted windows in front of the driveway. So I became the personal bodyguard of Inga Gerber, the manager of the Solid Bank. I quit my former job. My bosses did not want to let me go. There are a lot of engineers, but good turners can be counted on the fingers of one hand. But I insisted, and, in the end, I was still dismissed at my own request. But at parting I was told that if I changed my mind, they would be happy to hire me back. I also attended my son's wedding. Everything was very modest. A few friends of Natasha and Edward and myself. We sat in a cafe and drank a little, and at about 10 p.m. we left. Everything went well except for a small incident. As the evening drew to a close, a well-dressed, unfamiliar young man came up to our table. Edward Zagorski? He politely addressed my son. Mrs. Shumskaya congratulates you on your wedding. The man handed Edward an envelope. The guests sitting at our table fell silent. My son was the first to break the silence. Please tell Mrs. Shumsky that I do not accept gifts from strangers. Edward looked at me. The man stood for a while, holding the envelope in his hands, then nodded his head, put the unaccepted gift into an inside pocket of his jacket and left. For a moment I thought I saw the figure of Michelle at the back of the hall. My heart beat faster. I wondered if I still had feelings for her. Wishing happiness to the young people, I went home that very evening. I was only given one day off and had to go to work tomorrow. To be honest, I had a vague idea about my future work life. I honestly told the head of the bank's security service. But he patted me on the shoulder and told me that my duties were not so much as a bodyguard, but more as a companion to Mrs. Gerber. I just have to be with her at all times and accompany her to business and informal meetings. Her physical security will be taken care of by other, specially trained people. He gave me a plastic pass card and a Glock 18 pistol with a laminated carry permit issued in my name. Before starting my duties, I went to the narcological and psychiatric dispensaries, where I received certificates that I was not crazy and not an alcoholic. When I handed them to the chief of the security service, he smiled. I didn't doubt it, but order is order. The chief put the car keys in front of me. You will have to live in the house of Inga. Stay there around the clock. Accompany her to and from work. And wherever she tells you to go. The chief stood up and held out his hand to me. Good luck. The evening before my first day of work, I visited the barber shop, shaved and got my clothes ready. In the morning I got up early. I put on black jeans, a white shirt, and a black tweed jacket, loose fitting so that I couldn't see the holster under my arm. I pulled on my black shoes, threw on my coat, and headed to work. So far, everything suited me fine. I lived in the apartment of a friend who had gone abroad for 6 months. But he was coming back in a week. Therefore, living in the house of Inga suited me fine. Getting into a black Lexus, I drove to the intersection of the avenue and the street leading to the elite cottage village, the same in which I once lived with Michelle. The intersection offered an amazing view of the pine-covered, old city park. But I glanced indifferently at the snow-covered pines, turned right, and headed for the bank manager's house. Half an hour later I was there. The gate was open. I drove up to the house, parked the car, and got out. I approached a 2-story mansion lost in the depths of an ancient park. Careful not to slip, I climbed the frost-covered steps. It was quite early, and the janitor had not yet had time to clean them and sprinkle them with sand and salt. I rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened, and a sleepy, tall, young blonde girl appeared in the doorway. Posh, golden blonde hair fell in waves over her shoulders. Her mounds of breasts were visible beneath the corsage with an elongated neckline. Her slender waist, ample hips, and long legs completed a landscape that was impossible to look away from. The piercing blue eyes put me in a half-conscious state. The pause was dragging on, and the blonde was the first to go. "Who do you want?" she asked grudgingly, pressing her hand to her mouth, trying to hide a yawn. "Good morning. I'm here to see Inga. Are you selling something?" The maid looked me in the eyes with a challenge. "Excuse me. I was too busy looking at you. Is your curiosity satisfied?" "Rather, I am delighted." I pulled out of my pocket a pass. "I'm Edward Zagorski. I'll be working for you." She looked at me incredulously. "There's no need to get so excited." I smiled as charmingly as possible. "Is Inga home?" "Yes." She led me into the living room. "Wait, I'll warn the hostess about your arrival. What did you say your name was?" "Zagorski. Edward Zagorski." "Valentina." She introduced herself and left the room wiggling her hips. Valentina returned a few minutes later. "Your mistress is waiting for you," she led me to the door. I turned the knob and entered the long, narrow room, dark with heavily curtained windows. Inga stood in the middle of the room and didn't even look at me. Tensely frozen, she stared out the only window that was not curtained. I waited a while, getting used to the half-light. The woman turned to me. "Hello, Edward." She spoke in a low, husky voice. "Are you ready to begin your work?" "Yes." I stared at the hostess. "Have you been warned that you will live here?" She didn't seem to hear my answer. "Is there no objection?" "No objections." "Will they show me my room?" "Yes, of course." "Valentina, show Edward out." The room I was given was on the second floor. Quite spacious room contained a massive oak table, a large comfortable leather armchair, and a large bed against the wall. Opposite the table was a fireplace, over which hung 2 antique guns. On the table was a statue of a knight and several books. Valentina was standing in the doorway, keeping a close eye on me. "If you need anything, just let me know." Breakfast was in 15 minutes. Valentina did her best to hide her curiosity. "That's all right for now, thank you. Can you show me where the dining room is?" I smiled with the tips of my lips and looked at the maid. Valentina blushed. "Follow me." She turned without waiting for my answer and began to walk down the stairs, holding up her short skirt. "You did everything you could to get me to quarrel with my son." Michelle blushed with anger. "You still don't understand that he's my son too. Calm down and don't yell." I tried to contain my emotions. Michelle somehow found my address and showed up at my door late last night, clearly intending to cause a scandal. I was not burning with the desire to argue with her and wanted not even to open the door. But then I thought that her scream would rouse the whole house. "Michelle, let's talk business. What do you want from me?" "That I would reconcile you with the son." "But that's your business." "I didn't tell Edward anything. You're the one who showed him your lover by letting him touch your breasts in front of your son. What do you want from me now?" I spoke calmly, trying not to raise my voice. But he not only did not invite me to the wedding and refused to accept a gift. It seemed to me that Michelle was about to cry. In front of me in a gorgeous evening gown and mind-blowing fur coat sat a well-groomed young woman who was once my wife. "And what are these tricks? You turned down the job I offered you at my company. But when Inga beckoned you to take it, you took it. Did you have a thing with her? Is she your mistress? Don't let me see her, I'll tear her hair out." Michelle was no longer in control of her emotions. "Michelle, you haven't forgotten that it was you who cheated on me for 6 months with Chomsky. That it was you who left me in cold blood and went to your lover. That it was you who watched indifferently when his thugs tried to beat me up. It is not for you to lay a claim on me." I looked her straight in the eye. "As for your son, you decide for yourself. He's a grown man and he decides for himself who he wants to be with. Now go away. I have to work tomorrow." It seemed to me that when Michelle left, she tried to hide her guilty look. My job was not at all burdensome. In the morning I took my mistress to the bank's head office. At lunchtime I followed her to the cafe. I waited for her to drink coffee and gossip with her friends, sitting at a nearby table and pretending to read a magazine. Then we'd go back to her office, and I was practically free for the rest of the day. In the evening I would pick Inga up and take her home. At first I was looked at with interest friends of the hostess. But she seemed to quickly explain to them that I am no more than a piece of furniture, and the ladies stopped paying attention to me. When I got home the hostess had dinner and went to her room, and I sat in my room all evening watching TV and quietly played the guitar. Work was like heaven on earth. Taking advantage of my free time, I drove up to the university and probed about my reinstatement. It turned out that the dean of the Faculty of Mechanics was an old acquaintance of mine. At one time we served together in the army, and later we crossed paths at work. The dean promised to help. After 2 days he called me back and told me that I could be reinstated to the 5th year of the correspondence department. It was only necessary to pass the test for the subjects I had studied at the time, but was not graded. A colleague helped me again, and soon I received my credits and a correspondence student ticket. Everything seemed fine, but by the end of the first month I was so bored that I was about to quit my job. In the morning, on the way to the office, I was about to open my mouth to give a monologue about my dismissal, as Inga touched my shoulder. "Edward, do you have a decent suit?" Alas, no. Somehow I didn't have to buy one. I had nowhere to go. In the rearview mirror, I saw how she raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Strange. Why, you and your wife did not go to parties?" My ex-wife, I stressed the word ex, was doing fine without my participation. Moreover, in the last 6 months of our marriage she had someone to attend such events with. The hostess was quiet for a while, as if she was deciding what to do next. "Let's go to the store and find you something. I have to get you some clothes." She was quiet for a while. The boutique princess was not far from the bank. As soon as we entered, a young saleswoman rushed over to us, almost running. "Inga, I am glad to see you. Do you want something for yourself?" She sweetly chirped. "There are a few novelties. Next time, Lyra. I need to find something for a young man." Inga took me under the arm, demonstrating to the saleswoman our special relationship. Saleswoman Lyra comprehensively nodded. "There are some smart models. I'll bring them in a minute." After a while, Lyra and her assistant brought several men's suits. "I would recommend this one." She handed me a black suit with a slight sheen. "The fitting room is this way. Vika, take him there." I doomed to follow Vika in a small fitting room. When I put on a suit, there was a knock on the door. "Here, shoes, white shirt and tie." I took off my jacket over my shirt and tried on my shirt. The clothes fit me perfectly. I looked in the mirror. A middle-aged man was looking at me, with signs of misery on his face. A sweet comforter for old women. That's it. I wonder if she'll buy me panties too. Inga also approved of my choice. When Lyra voiced the price, I almost fainted. But Inga did not flinch. Indifferently handed her card, finished her free coffee, and smoothly swaying her hips went to the exit. I skid after her, holding the bags in my hands. "A new boyfriend." "Only old," said a woman's voice behind me. "No way, it's just right." With a hint of envy, the other answered. I did not have time to hear the rest because of the loud slamming of the door. As we drove to the office, I wondered why I needed a suit. Probably going to a social event and dragging me along. When we got to the office, Inga asked me to come in. "Today I'm invited to the opening of the art gallery. The entire royalty of the city will be there. You can't refuse. You'll be my date. We have to be there by 7 in the evening." My hostess instructed me in a businesslike tone. "Don't forget to change." She turned her attention to her laptop, and I realized that the audience was over. I helped Inga out of the car, gave the keys to the valet, and, supporting the lady by the elbow, headed for the entrance to the gallery. Inga was right. The entire city's beau monde had gathered here today. Cavaliers and husbands had brought their beauties for a walk and were proudly showing them off to the secular public. Wives and lovers exhibited on their necks and wrists jewelry worth many, many thousands of green. All this herd of chewing and drinking heads slowly paraded around the room, pretending to be interested in the multicolored masks hanging on the walls. Inga and I blended harmoniously into the landscape and began to drift leisurely in a large circle. "Edward, bring me some champagne." Inga was looking at the entrance without taking her eyes off it. I also turned my head. There was something to see. A colorful couple was entering the hall. And the woman was SOSO, to a T. But her companion, a tall middle-aged man, dressed in a fancy cream suit. Almost my age. A tan face with piercing blue eyes. It was evident that the man painfully tolerates such an unsightly companion. Well, the companion was glittering with diamonds and dazzling white teeth, reminiscent of an obsessive toothpaste commercial. Inga, not taking her eyes off the glittering couple, mechanically took the glass of champagne I had extended. For a moment I saw that the playboy's eyes stopped on her. He smiled broadly, and then he and his companion walked toward us. "Hello, my dear." Waltzingly stretching his vowels, he said, kissing Inga's hand secularly. "Meet Irina, my friend." White-toothed friend smiled and slightly inclined her head. Introduced me to her interlocutor. Inga did not think it necessary. Yes, I was not particularly worried about this. I was interested in other characters. In the whirlpool of people, I saw Michelle on the arm with Mr. Shumsky. They were talking about something, stopping from time to time in front of paintings hanging on the walls. But it was immediately apparent that only Michelle was interested in this mess. Mr. Shumsky did not care about anything. Judging by his gloomy and bored face, he wanted to get away as quickly as possible. Yes, Michelle has no luck with interlocutors. She was still talking emotionally to her husband when she saw me. She even stopped talking. Her companion did not notice anything and silently stared somewhere in the wall. Michelle instantly saw Inga. Her eyes narrowed as she looked at her supposed rival. I even thought she was going to kill the unsuspecting Inga with her gaze. I was curious for a moment. If they were brought together one-on-one, who would win? I pretended not to notice my ex's eloquent gaze and stared indifferently at the opposite wall when Michelle's voice sounded just under my ear. "Hi, honey. Long time no see. What a wonderful dress, it so highlights your figure." "Hi, honey. Good to see you." Inga was not inferior to Michelle in her Pharisaism. The ladies kissed, barely touching each other's cheeks. "Oh, and you're here," indifferently muttered the former. "Can you imagine? I almost never managed to get him to go to any of these events." Michelle nodded at me. "Even under the threat of death?" She laughed pretentiously. "Honey, you just didn't know how to use it." Inga's answer sounded more than ambiguous. "Well, I won't interrupt." Michelle picked up her treasure under her arm and dragged it toward the buffet. I had studied my ex-wife well for a quarter of a century and could see that she was shaking with rage. Inga continued her macho conversation. It was obvious to all that she was reproaching him about something. Her face was flushed with anger, and at one point she slapped him in the face. We were standing behind a pillar, so no one in the audience noticed. The playboy's face twisted in anger. He had already raised his hand to slap Inga back, but I managed to intercept him. "Calm down and leave." I gritted my teeth in a threatening tone. The man tried to pull his arm out of my grasp, but he wasn't very good at it. I took a step forward and closed my grip on Inga. "You idiot!" She spoke softly from behind me. "We will meet again, dear." The man took his arm and grabbed the diamond companion, who didn't understand anything, and rushed out the door. Tears welled up in Inga's eyes. "Edward, bring me some cognac," she whispered. Wow, do we not want to get drunk with grief? I did not ask what it was. It was none of my business. By the end of the evening, Inga was very drunk. I threw a fur coat on her and gently supported her by the hand and led her to the exit. Her heel broke on the stairs, and she literally fell into my arms. I carefully carried her to the car and put her in the back seat. On the way home, I thought we were being followed by an unknown car. The light in the hallway was on, and there were no people in the house. I leaned Inga's body against the wall and closed the front door. Then I carried her in my arms to the bedroom, which was on the second floor. There was a huge bed under a white canopy, and a truffle case full of feminine knickknacks like elephants and kittens. The dim light and subtle scent of lavender. All this inspired madness. I helped her to the bathroom, and then laid her gently on the bed and covered her with the covers. I didn't turn off the nightlight. As soon as I went to the door, I heard her voice. "Do not go, stay." I sat down again on the wide bed. Inga turned to me. "Hold me." She pressed herself against my shoulder. I shook my head, pushing the voluptuous thoughts away. Yes, it is not harmful to dream. After a few minutes, Inga sniffled. I carefully removed her hand and rolled over on his back. So I lay there half the night without undressing. When I was sure that my mistress was sound asleep, I carefully put out the night light and quietly left the bedroom. I didn't need any more adventures on my fifth place. In my room, I turned on the kettle and made coffee. Then I took my guitar and quietly played slow blues. It was Saturday morning. I went down to the kitchen, and cook Aunt Masha treated me to pancakes with honey. I was already eating the second portion when Valia, the maid, called me to the hostess. Inga was sick. Swollen red eyes, hands hidden under a down scarf. "Did you put me to bed?" she asked, avoiding to look me in the eyes. "Yes," I said, and, giving my face a silly expression, I blinked faithfully as many times as I could. "And undressed?" "Yes. But don't worry, I didn't steal anything. All the clothes are there." Inga choked on her tea. It was obvious that she was afraid to ask the next question. I decided to come to her rescue. "You went to bed and chased me away. That is all. And nothing more." "Nothing. What was supposed to happen? You fell asleep right away, and I left." I couldn't tell by the look in her eyes what was more, relief or disappointment. I want to go to the hunting lodge today. It is 150 kilometers from the city. Near Berezinska Forest. I'm ready. Only on the way we'll refuel. I left the canteen and went to get the car ready. As we were leaving, I saw the maid talking to someone on the phone. We drove up to the one-story, pine log house when it got dark. The dust, the dampness, the smell of untreated pine boards used to upholster the walls, all of it hit my nose as I opened the heavy front door. I tried to turn on the lights, but the switch didn't work. I had to turn on the breaker in the basement first. Breathing on the back of my neck, Inga muttered. I come here quite rarely, and when I leave, I always turn off the electricity. I'm afraid of a short circuit. I noticed that it was much cooler in the house than outside. I'll go down to the basement and flip the switch. Inga took a dust-covered flashlight from a coat rack and opened the creaking door to the cellar and began to descend carefully, shining the faintly lit lantern under her feet. In the meantime, light the fireplace and look for something to drink. The light came on. Inga found and turned on the switch. I looked around. The room appeared to be a living room. There were 2 wicker armchairs by the fireplace. A little closer to the window was an oak table. Above the fireplace hung a large black and white photograph. On it stood a group of young men cuddled together. They were staring into the lens and laughing. In the very center of it stood a girl who looked a lot like Inga. Beside her, hugging her shoulders, stood a cheerful guy. The playboy I had seen at the gallery opening. Only much younger. Inga in the picture reminded me of someone else I'd seen before. But of whom? I lit a fire in the fireplace of the small living room. Rummaging through the old cupboard, I found a full bottle of cognac and a couple of clean glasses. So, are you getting the hang of it? Inga walked in so silently that I even flinched at her voice. I somehow quickly got used to the silence in the house and the idea that we were all alone in the neighborhood, and I already felt like a hunter lost in the woods. It was quite dark. From the kitchen window we could see the tall pines and the shore of the frozen lake. I could see that the wind had risen over the lake. It was so quiet that one could hear the beating of the heart. Beautiful place, isn't it? Inga silently crept up behind me again. Pour me a cognac. We went back into the living room. Is there a radio? I wanted something to relieve my sudden melancholy. Inga walked over to the radio on a small table and flicked the switch. From the speaker came the melody of a sentimental French hit of the 60s. I poured myself and Inga a drink and sat in the wicker armchair in front of the fireplace, glass in hand. I had no thoughts. I just wanted to sit and look at the fire in the company of a beautiful and, most importantly, not clingy woman. Inga sat opposite and was silent, also looking at the fire. The old music rushed back to my memory, and I unwittingly remembered a winter evening with Michelle on New Year's Eve. I even shook my head at her image. She was no longer the champion of my inner world. The logs in the fireplace burned through and disintegrated into smoldering embers. The wind picked up and shook the shutters and windows. The howling in the fireplace made me feel uneasy. I could see that Inga was shivering. Suddenly I heard a thumping sound in the empty house. I froze. What was that? Was it the front door slamming? Had someone broken into the house? Dazed, Inga and I sat in chairs by the extinguished fireplace and listened to the darkness of the night. Outside the windows was a night in which a real storm was raging. I cautiously stood up, took the poker from the stand, and crept to the door to the corridor. I jerked the door open. The key was in the lock on the front door. Damn it! I locked it myself. I jerked the knob. It was locked. There was another bang, like coming from the kitchen. I gingerly pulled the kitchen door open with the poker and peeked inside. It was empty. There were 2 more knocks. And then I saw that one window had opened in the onslaught of the wind and was banging against the frame. I lived to see it. Scared of the kind of trifle so often used in horror movies. I struggled to close the window, which was unwilling to yield to me because of the wind, and returned to the living room. As I held the poker in my hand, I suddenly remembered that I had a pistol in a holster under my arm. The thought made me feel completely ashamed. It was good that Inga did not see my face at that moment. If we don't add wood, The fireplace will soon go out. Inga shivered. I don't want to go anywhere in this weather. Maybe you could go get some firewood. It's stacked near the boat shed. The prospect of staying here overnight did not inspire me much, even in the company of a beautiful woman. But there was nothing to do. I threw on my jacket and went outside. I walked cautiously down the icy steps made of wild stone to the boat shed. The boat shed was a sturdy structure with deer antlers on the gable. At the wall, under a canopy that was an extension of the roof, was neatly stacked firewood. I had already placed the second log on the bent left arm when I heard a rustling sound behind me. I turned around quickly, but I had no time to dodge the blow to my head that had stunned me. Something crunched in my skull, and a sharp pain pierced my whole body. Then everything swirled before my eyes, and I fell down. I woke up from being dragged with my arms around my armpits. The one dragging me was breathing heavily in the back of my head. He was heavy. I could tell by his voice that he was a man, and that he was talking about me. As if through a veil, I realized he wanted to kill me. My reaction was purely instinctive. With a sharp jerk, I twisted around and grabbed my opponent. He stumbled backward in surprise, and collapsed on his back. I piled on top of him, trying to grab him by the throat. But the stranger quickly came to his senses and punched me in the head, right where I'd been hit. I cried out in pain, but my hands gripped my opponent's throat even harder. The man beneath me wheezed. By some incredible effort, he managed to throw his leg up and roll over me. We rolled toward the lake and plunged into the still unfrozen strip of water near the shore. Falling down, my opponent had managed to get above me and was now trying to strangle me. I clenched my fists and punched the man in the ears from both sides. My opponent was distracted for a moment and loosened his grip. At that moment, I fumbled for the knife on his belt. I plucked it from its sheath and stabbed the man several times under the ribs. He opened his mouth wide in pain and slowly crawled to his side. I crawled ashore, spitting up and gulping greedily for air. The man was no longer moving. Leaving the man's body lying there, I cautiously made my way toward the house. Putting my hand under my arm, I pulled out my gun. I tried to move as quietly as possible, but I slipped on the stone steps and hit my foot. The pain had a sobering effect on me. I suddenly felt cold. Water was dripping off my wet clothes, turning into icicles in the cold. The light in the house was on, and the half-open door smelled warm. I peered cautiously into the living room. There was a man sitting in a wicker armchair, with his back to me in front of the fireplace. To his left, tied to a chair, was Inga. Blood was dripping from her smashed lip onto her blouse. She twitched several times, trying to free herself, but the ropes held her tight. "Have you calmed down?" The man was still sitting with his back to me. But his voice sounded familiar. "What you are?" Inga's voice cracked with rage. "You idiot, you ruined my whole life." I could hear the man smirk. "Of course you are. But you liked scum, didn't you? That's why you did not think twice and jumped into bed with me. You even got pregnant. You thought you'd tie me to you." The man turned his head and I recognized him. People's artist and playboy. It was your daddy that stopped me from getting what I wanted. But I got my revenge anyway. And you didn't even understand. Playboy poured a glass of cognac. "Do you want some?" "No." Inga groaned with helplessness. "So, there, your baby was born alive. It was a girl. Strong and healthy. It wasn't hard to make an arrangement with the doctor. A fat stack of bucks and compromising evidence shut him up for good. The girl was immediately bought for her organs. Some married couple. Their baby was dying and they had no choice. The money they paid me was long enough. And they told you the baby was dead. They even gave you a certificate." "No. No, you're lying." Inga tried to free herself from the ropes. "I've never seen a man scream like that. You don't have to believe it if you don't want to. I told you this because you're doomed. We already finished your lover, and soon you'll join him. There's enough room in the ice hole for all of us." The man took a sip of cognac and raised his gun. I decided to act without Chinese ceremonies. Stand up. Hands on your head. The police are working. I yelled in the voice of a drunken non-commissioned officer standing in front of the recruits. From surprise, the playboy jumped out of his chair, knocked over the bottle of cognac on the table and stared dazedly at me and the gun pointed at him. Hands behind your head, turn around. I kept yelling like a man on fire. The man obediently raised his hands and turned his back to me. I quickly stepped into the room and hit him on the back of the head with the pistol grip. Yes, Mao Zedong was right, the rifle gives birth to power. And although I'm holding a pistol instead of a rifle, it doesn't change much the essence of the old Chinese communists' winged expression. I untied Inga. She looked at me with dazed eyes, not knowing where she was. Yes, after such a man could go crazy and hear a woman and even the mother. I forcibly poured some brandy into her mouth and laid her on the couch, covering her with my jacket. I sat the playboy's flaccid body in an armchair and tied his hands to the armrests. Then I undressed and hung my clothes on the chair in front of the fireplace, letting them dry for a while. I put a gun on the table to complete the image. Imagine the picture. Me sitting in just my swim trunks in front of a clothed alpha male. A super spectacle. The perverts would drool. I picked up the bottle. There was still cognac at the bottom, and I took a sip straight from the neck. I looked at the playboy. His eyelids twitched a few times. He came to his senses, pretending to be a hose. I patted his cheeks with my gun. Uncle! Stop pretending, you dirty pervert. You've been staring at me for a long time, nasty. Where is Nicholas? The commissioner asked in a weak voice. Aren't you attracted to my pumped-up body? I openly mocked him. Your Nicholas is dead. I threw him ashore so as not to disturb his decomposition. I took another sip of cognac. Did you kill him? I did. Shouldn't I have? I chuckled drunkenly. You're finished, you hear, finished. The playboy twitched his arms a few times, as if he wanted to tear the armrests off. You'll never get out of here alive. They'll just shoot you for murder. I looked at the twitching alpha male and I thought I saw foam coming out of his mouth and smoke coming out of his fifth place. I don't think it will come to that if you tell me everything. I got up slowly from the table. Who do you think you are? The playboy twitched his arms again. If you remember, I used to be in the intelligence service. That's one thing we learned, but we were trained to untie our tongues. I kicked him in the teeth with the handle of my pistol, for a start. He coughed and spat out some teeth with blood. That's okay, as an honorary alpha male, the dentist will put in new ones at a big discount. After an hour of hilarious questioning, I knew everything. Including the role of Valentina's maid. It was she who had warned the playboy that his mistress was going out of town. Inga, as a banker, was well aware of the machinations of her ex. In the near future, she was going to release the dirt on him to the police. This caused a quick and harsh reaction of the playboy. It is easier and cheaper to eliminate a dangerous man than to negotiate with him. My clothes dried up a little and I got dressed. Then I pulled out my cell phone and called the police. It was 3:30 in the morning when a patrol car pulled up to the house, lighting up the area with its red and blue flashing beacon. Accompanied by the police, we drove back into town. The showdown lasted almost 2 days. At last they left us alone, limiting us to an undertaking not to leave the city. What really helped was the recording of the playboy's conversation with Inga and me, which I had managed to make on my cell phone. Inga didn't show up for work for a week. It was scary to look at her. She cried all the time. I tried to keep an eye on her, afraid she might do something to herself. The police made a sluggish check of the maternity hospital. But they found no trace of the abducted girl. The doctor was dead, the staff had long since resigned or retired. In the end, the investigation came to a standstill. 2 months passed after our unsuccessful trip out of town. Inga went to work. I was staying with her. Nothing had changed in our relationship. She was coldly polite to me, no more. Ahead of me loomed a session, and in the evenings I leafed through my textbooks. One late March evening my son called me. Daddy! Congratulations! You're about to become a grandfather. Natasha's pregnant? I couldn't hide my joy. Yes, Daddy, 4 months pregnant. And you didn't say anything until now? I was afraid of jinxing you. Did you call your mother? The son was silent, only a sniffle in the tube. Edward! Call your mom. She always loved you, maybe even more than me. I remembered Inga's tragedy. Listen to me, call her, you're her son. More? I don't think so. All right, I will. A week later Edward called and said that he was going to come visit. I asked the landlady for 3 days off to be with my son and daughter-in-law. Furnishings. Come, make yourselves comfortable. A smiling Inga came down the stairs to us, feel as before. She did not finish speaking, but stared at Natasha, pressing her hands convulsively to her breast. Oh my God! It cannot be! It cannot be! My baby, my baby! She spoke softly. Inga began to slowly settle on the steps. I barely had time to catch her. Edward, help! I shouted at the bewildered son. We moved the woman on the sofa. Grandma Masha, who jumped out to hear the noise, brought a glass of water. Natasha stood and silently looked at Inga. Then she looked at me in confusion. Natasha! It looks like your mother. I smiled. The young woman slowly sank to the floor. What's going on here? Michelle's frightened voice came through the door. What happened next? Everything is fine. Natasha really turned out to be Inga's missing daughter. We don't know for what reason the people who had bought her had abandoned their plans and put the child in a home. Michelle and Inga very quickly stepped into the role of grandmothers. Natasha gave birth to a healthy baby girl who was named Victoria. As you may have guessed, Edward forgave his mother. He and Natasha moved in with Inga. And the previously dull house was filled with the babbling of an infant. Michelle left Shumsky after a month and took my last name. Perhaps she still hoped for something. Inga didn't give up hope either. Only I did not know all this, but to tell you the truth, and did not want to know. The fast train was carrying me to the northeast of a vast country, with the rattle of the train wheels. The May sun was slowly rising over the horizon. The blossoming rowan trees smelled refreshingly spicy. Mountain ash blossoms a little later here than in the middle belt. Petals of bird cherry blossoms slowly swirled in the transparent air. I walked on the spring ground. A warm breeze gently swayed the grass. Juicy aspens and young birches were basking in the gentle rays of the morning sun. I deeply inhaled the fragrance of the flowers. At last I was free. It was morning. The morning of a happy man. What do you think of our story today? In my opinion, the wife has once again acted as unpleasantly as possible towards her husband. It was possible to turn everything in a more acceptable way. What's your opinion? Write in the comments. Until new videos.